Welcome to our channel. We're so glad you're here for today's story. Before we dive in, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so leave a comment below and share your location with us. Your thoughts and feedback mean the world to us. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, so you won't miss our next special story coming tomorrow. Get ready for an unforgettable journey, and thank you for being part of our growing community. The diplomat's son who slapped a royal guard. What happened next will shock you. Ethan Walker, a 32-year-old heir to a prestigious political dynasty, had never known the consequences that ordinary people face. Raised in a world where doors were always open, and his requests were met with a mere snap of his fingers, Ethan was accustomed to a life free from the struggles that others dealt with. His father, James Walker, the powerful foreign minister, had carefully constructed a life for his son, one that shielded him from the hard realities of life and placed him in a world of privilege. This bubble of protection, however, was about to be pierced in an instant, and it would change Ethan's life forever. On that fateful day, Ethan arrived at Buckingham Palace for a diplomatic event, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floors, the weight of his arrogance and entitlement nearly palpable in the air. With every step, he reveled in the attention his presence commanded. His family's power, the influence his father wielded, the wealth that had shaped his existence. It was all on full display as he moved through the palace grounds, his confidence oozing from every pore. As he passed through the crowd, people looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and, perhaps, thinly veiled disdain. But in Ethan's world, such looks were irrelevant. After all, who could possibly challenge someone like him? He was the son of a foreign minister, third in line to chair the International Security Council, and someone with diplomatic immunity in 14 countries. The security checkpoints he passed through that day were nothing more than formalities, minor inconveniences to be dealt with as quickly as possible. He barely acknowledged the personnel who requested his identification, looking at them as if they were part of the background, mere objects in his path. His sense of superiority, instilled in him over the years by his father's constant interventions, had corroded his perception of the world around him. He no longer recognized the social cues that signaled boundaries or respect for authority. Why would he? In his world, authority was something that bent to his will, not something that could stand in his way. As Ethan approached the area where diplomats were gathering, he moved with the same entitled determination he had always carried. The red velvet ropes that marked the boundary didn't even register to him. Why should they? Those barriers were meant for people who didn't belong in the inner circle, the common folk, the lesser men. Not him. His father's position ensured that he could pass through any door, ignore any restriction, and gain access to whatever he desired. But this time, the world was about to show him just how mistaken he was. The royal guard standing at the entrance, a figure of unwavering discipline, was not a mere decoration. He wasn't someone who would look the other way or allow Ethan to slip past with a simple glance. The guard stood tall, his posture perfect, his eyes focused straight ahead, unmovable, unshakable. The two worlds, Ethan's world of privilege and the world of protocol and duty, collided in that moment. Ethan's eyes narrowed and a flash of irritation crossed his face. How dare this lowly guard block his path? With practiced indignation, he demanded, "Do you know who I am?" His words were dripping with arrogance, expecting the guard to step aside in acknowledgement of his importance. But the guard's eyes remained fixed, his posture unchanging. The walls of Ethan's carefully constructed reality began to crack. Frustration bubbled up inside him. His cheeks flushed as he stepped closer to the guard, his voice rising in anger. "My father chairs the committee that funds your entire operation," Ethan hissed, his words punctuated with a venomous tone. "You will step aside now." But the guard remained silent, his response calm, measured, and without emotion. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, sir. This area is restricted to official delegates only." Ethan's patience snapped. He had been accustomed to everyone around him bowing to his will, But here stood a man who wouldn't bend. His entitled worldview was shattered, and for the first time, he was confronted with an obstacle he couldn't navigate through sheer force of will. His anger took over, and in a moment of reckless arrogance, he lifted his hand and slapped the guard across the face. The sound of the slap was sharp, but it didn't carry the weight that Ethan had expected. The guard's head turned slightly, with the force of the strike, but his eyes never wavered. He didn't flinch, didn't show any signs of weakness. His composure, his discipline, his training, everything about the guard remained intact, unbroken. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the world he had known, the world of power and influence, was not invincible. This one act, this one slap, had set off a chain of events that would unravel everything he had known. The crowd around them gasped, and phones rose to capture the moment. Ethan, standing there with a smirk of triumph, was unaware that his arrogance had already been captured from multiple angles. Security cameras had caught everything: the smirk, the slap, and the unflinching response of the guard. Little did Ethan know, these silent digital witnesses would soon become central to the unfolding drama. This was the moment that would change his life forever, and no amount of wealth or family connections would be able to protect him from the consequences that were about to follow. As the sound of the slap echoed through the grand hall, the air itself seemed to freeze. Ethan stood there, the weight of his arrogance hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The royal guard, unmoved by his impulsive act, remained standing firm, as if nothing had happened. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, his posture flawless, a silent sentinel embodying centuries of tradition and duty. The realization hit Ethan like a freight train. He had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. He had spent his entire life being sheltered from the consequences of his actions. From the moment he could walk, doors had opened for him. Money, power, and influence had been the tools of his world, and with them, he had become accustomed to bending the rules. His father, James Walker, a man who had crafted his own empire of political influence, ensured that no obstacle stood in Ethan's way. Whether it was broken property, academic failures, or social missteps, James always made sure his son's mistakes were erased before they could have any lasting effect. Ethan had grown up in a bubble of exceptionalism, a life where every mistake was forgiven, every flaw overlooked, every consequence dodged. His entire existence had been built on the notion that rules were for everyone else, not for him. He'd learned early on that the world bent to his family's power, that his name alone could open doors, grant him access, and give him control. His father's reach had shielded him from the harsh reality most people faced, and Ethan had come to believe that the world operated on his terms. But as he stood there in front of the royal guard, his world began to crumble. The guard's unwavering silence was a wall that Ethan's privilege couldn't penetrate. His voice, filled with indignation, demanded the guard step aside, as if the man's years of training, his commitment to duty, could be erased by the simple force of Ethan's words. "Don't you know who I am?" Ethan had spat, but the guard didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge him with a glance. He simply stood there, as immovable as the stone pillars that held the palace walls. Ethan's anger swelled. His father's influence had always worked. No matter the situation, no matter the person, someone had always been there to smooth things over, to make the problem disappear. But this guard, this unyielding figure, didn't care about Ethan's name or his family's political power. To the guard, Ethan was just another person trying to push through a boundary that had existed for centuries. There was no special treatment. There was no concession. There was only duty. Ethan's frustration flared. His world, where everything had always been easy, suddenly felt like a prison. His arrogance, once his greatest weapon, now felt like a curse. He leaned in closer to the guard, his voice low and threatening, his hands trembling with fury. "My father funds your entire operation," he hissed, his words thick with venom. "You will move. Now." The guard remained silent, unshaken. His gaze stayed straight ahead, and his stance was unbroken. Ethan's face flushed with rage as he realized that his name, his wealth, his father's power, none of it mattered here. The guard's simple response, "I'm afraid I cannot do that, sir. This area is restricted," was the final crack in the illusion Ethan had built around himself. And in that moment, something inside Ethan snapped. He was used to getting what he wanted, used to the world bending around him. But now, faced with someone who didn't care about his name or his privilege, his sense of entitlement surged uncontrollably. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, he raised his hand and slapped the guard across the face. The sound was sharp and sudden, like a gunshot in the stillness of the room. The guard's head turned slightly with the impact, but his composure remained intact. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. His eyes never wavered from their fixed point. Ethan stood there, a sense of triumph creeping over him, completely unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. The room around him seemed to hold its breath, and the cameras that had been quietly capturing the event now captured something far more dangerous than Ethan had realized. The slap wasn't just a personal affront. It was an act of disrespect that would set off a chain of events far beyond his control. Gasps rippled through the crowd, phones were raised in unison, and the whispers began to swell. Ethan, still standing there with a smug smile on his face, was oblivious to the reality that was rapidly descending upon him. He had crossed a line that no amount of wealth or power could protect him from. The consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he never could have imagined. As the slap landed, the grand hall fell silent, and the world seemed to pause. Ethan stood frozen, his hands still suspended in the air as the sound of his arrogance reverberated through the space. But the guard, unmoved, unbroken, stood silent, his head turning only slightly, his expression unwavering. To anyone watching, it was clear that this moment wasn't just a personal clash. It was the beginning of something much larger. In that split second, everything Ethan had ever known about his own power, his own control, began to crumble. The crowd's murmurs swelled into hushed gasps, followed by the unmistakable click of smartphones raising into the air. Ethan's mind raced, but he barely registered the phones capturing the scene. His heart pounded as he looked around, feeling the eyes of those present shift from indifference to something more potent: disbelief, judgment, and quiet disdain. He hadn't realized it yet, but his actions had already been immortalized, not just in the minds of those present, but in digital records that would spread far beyond this room. The tension in the air thickened, wrapping around Ethan like a vice. His usual world of influence and privilege suddenly felt distant, like a fog receding in the face of reality. In the weeks and months that had followed this moment, the security cameras would become the silent witnesses to his downfall. From 3 different angles, the footage captured every detail: the smirk on Ethan's face before the slap, the unfazed response of the guard, the steady discipline that Ethan couldn't understand, and most importantly, the moment where everything changed. The aftermath of the slap wasn't immediate. It didn't send a shockwave through the room right away. But it planted the seeds for something far greater, a diplomatic disaster waiting to unfold. Ethan stood there, his chest rising and falling in anger, unaware of the storm he had unleashed. His privileged world, which had always bent to his will, was starting to unravel around him piece by piece, and he didn't even know it yet. It wasn't until 2 men in charcoal suits appeared from nowhere, moving with calm precision, that Ethan realized the gravity of his actions. They weren't here to ask him to leave. They weren't here to reprimand him. No, this was something far more serious. A woman in a dark blue dress, her smile diplomatic but her eyes cold as ice, approached him with a voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Walker," she said, her tone clipped and firm, "I need you to come with us immediately." Her words were not a request. They were an order, and Ethan felt the world around him shift. Confusion swept through him like a flood. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice laced with the arrogance that had gotten him this far. But the woman's response was swift and unwavering. "Yes, sir. We know exactly who you are. That's precisely why we need to handle this situation with the utmost discretion." Her hand, firm but not forceful, landed on his elbow, guiding him away from the scene as the men in suits flanked him. As Ethan was escorted through the corridors of power, his mind raced with thoughts of his father, of the years he'd spent, bending the world to his will, of the countless times he'd escaped the consequences of his actions. He tried to gather his thoughts to process what was happening, but the overwhelming sensation of being controlled, of being led through these corridors like an animal to slaughter, began to chip away at the facade of control he had always maintained. The further they moved through the palace, the more Ethan felt the weight of reality pressing down on him. It wasn't the weight of physical restraint, but something far heavier. The weight of his own arrogance crumbling under the scrutiny of those who had seen it all before. He had expected the world to bend to his desires, but instead, it was bending him to its will. Ethan's stomach churned as he realized this wasn't some minor inconvenience, some diplomatic misunderstanding. This was the beginning of his fall from grace, the moment his entitlement met an institution that had stood the test of centuries. The royal guard, whose steadfast discipline had started it all, was now the symbol of everything Ethan had failed to see in himself. The guard's calm, unwavering presence had represented everything Ethan wasn't, a person who could stand firm, no matter the storm. And as Ethan was led to a small, unassuming room, the door closing softly behind him, the weight of the consequences finally settled in. It wasn't just about a slap anymore. It was about an international incident in the making, one that would take more than a few apologies or a quick phone call to fix. And as security personnel took their positions around him, Ethan realized that his life, the one of privilege, entitlement, and unchecked power, had just collided with something much larger than he could ever have imagined. The door clicked shut behind Ethan with a sound that felt louder than it was, each second that passed inside the small, sterile room feeling like an eternity. He stood there, his heart racing, trying to piece together the pieces of the disaster that was unfolding around him. The calm efficiency of the security team had left him no room for protest, no opportunity for defiance. His usual tactics, commanding attention, leveraging his father's influence, demanding respect, were useless here. This wasn't some minor inconvenience, some incident to be smoothed over with a few well-placed calls or favors. No, this was different. This was real, and he was trapped in it. The room was immaculate, with sleek, impersonal furniture that made Ethan feel more like an object than a person. There was no comfort here, no warmth, just cold reality. He could hear the faint murmur of voices from outside the room, but it was muffled, distant, like he was cut off from the world he once controlled. The weight of the moment began to settle on him, creeping in slowly at first, then suffocating him with each passing second. He couldn't escape it. His name, his family's reputation, all the privileges he had taken for granted, they meant nothing here. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt small. It wasn't just the physical confines of the room that made him feel boxed in. It was the realization that, outside of his father's protective bubble, he was nothing more than a person like anyone else. No special privileges, no immunity, no way to bend the rules to his will. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. His arrogance, his sense of entitlement had caught up with him, and now there was nowhere to hide. As the minutes ticked by, the harsh reality of the situation began to sink in. He wasn't just facing embarrassment or a public scandal. He was facing the collapse of the carefully constructed world he had lived in for the past 32 years. His mind raced with thoughts of what this would mean for him, for his future. He could already imagine the headlines, the fall of a privileged heir, the entitled son of a powerful minister, brought low by his own arrogance. It was a story he never thought would be his. The door opened, and the same woman in the dark blue dress stepped inside, followed by 2 more security personnel, their presence as imposing as ever. Ethan stood, his chest tightening as they took their positions around him. The lead officer, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen decades of men like him, regarded him with a calm, almost detached expression. She had already witnessed his kind many times before, people who thought they could sidestep the rules because of who they were or who they knew. But this was different. Ethan had crossed a line that no amount of family wealth could shield him from. "Mr. Walker," the officer began, her voice low and steady, "we know exactly who you are. That's precisely why we're here." Her words were not comforting. They were factual, clear. She wasn't here to offer him sympathy or to placate him. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was about an international incident, and Ethan was the one who had sparked it. The truth was inescapable. His father's influence, his family's power, and his own sense of invincibility could do nothing to protect him now. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, to demand answers, to try and twist the situation back in his favor. But the words caught in his throat. He was powerless. His usual bravado had melted away, replaced by the cold sting of reality. His father's voice, usually a shield against any threat, was now just a distant echo in his mind. No one was coming to rescue him. There were no secret backdoor deals, no strings to pull. In this room, in this moment, he was just a man facing the consequences of his own actions, and nothing could change that. The officer didn't wait for him to speak. She simply nodded, her expression still unreadable. "You'll be escorted from here," she said. "Your presence will no longer be welcomed at any diplomatic functions, effective immediately. You'll be banned from entry in 14 countries. Your actions have repercussions beyond this room, and they will be felt worldwide." Ethan's stomach dropped. The weight of her words crushed him like a physical force. He had thought he could navigate his way through anything, that his name would always carry him. But now that very name had become a symbol of entitlement, of disrespect, a symbol that would follow him for the rest of his life. And with that realization came the most painful truth of all. His world was no longer his to command. As the security personnel moved to guide him out of the room, Ethan's mind swirled with thoughts of how everything had changed in the blink of an eye. The privilege, the wealth, the influence. All of it was meaningless now. The silent dignity of the royal guard, who had stood unmoving in the face of his arrogance, had taught him the most valuable lesson of his life. Respect wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to earn. And in that moment, Ethan realized he had lost that respect, both from the world and from himself. Ethan was escorted out of the small room with a sense of defeat that he couldn't shake. The cold, impersonal walls around him seemed to close in as he was led through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, flanked by the same unyielding security officers who had taken control of the situation without a single word of comfort or understanding. The weight of what had just transpired crushed him with every step. He had always believed that his name, his family's legacy, would carry him through any storm. But now, that very name had become a symbol of everything he had taken for granted. The slap, the arrogance, the entitlement, everything he had thought was beneath him, now suddenly loomed over him like an immovable force. The walk to the exit felt like an eternity. Ethan's mind raced, but his thoughts were scattered, unable to focus on anything other than the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had settled in. What had started as a personal outburst, a brief moment of unrestrained arrogance, had turned into an international crisis. The guard's stoic silence, his disciplined response, had set the wheels in motion for something Ethan couldn't undo, no matter how hard he tried. As he stepped outside, the flash of cameras caught his attention. The reality of the situation began to sink in with brutal clarity. What had happened inside the palace was no longer a private matter. The cameras had captured everything: the slap, the confrontation, the way he had allowed his anger and entitlement to get the best of him. The footage, already spreading across the world's news outlets, was now inescapable. Social media exploded with the viral video, flooding Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Headlines began to form in real time. Diplomat son slaps royal guard. Diplomatic incident unfolds. The internet, which had once been a platform for Ethan to maintain his image, was now the very place where that image was being torn apart. The world reacted quickly. Comment sections filled with scorn, mockery, and outrage. Memes proliferated, some comical, others harsh and unforgiving. Ethan, once a figure of privilege and influence, had become the butt of a global joke. People across the globe, ordinary, people who had never heard his name before, now knew him only for his moment of arrogance, a fleeting second that would follow him for the rest of his life. Back in the world of politics, the damage was swift and far-reaching. The power of the Walker family, once unchallenged, was now in freefall. The diplomatic immunity Ethan had once taken for granted was revoked, along with his access to high-level functions and events. He was banned from entering 14 countries, the very nations where he had once wielded his father's influence. The list of countries banning him grew by the hour. In his family's mansion, the phone calls began to pour in. Ethan's father, James Walker, always the pillar of calm and control, was now desperately trying to contain the fallout. He called in political allies, lawyers, and PR specialists. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Every attempt to smooth over the situation only made it worse. James, who had built his empire on manipulation and subtlety, found himself blindsided by the very force he had worked so hard to avoid, the public's unforgiving gaze. Media outlets ran endless stories about Ethan's actions, some focusing on his entitled behavior, others on his history of unchecked arrogance. Investigative journalists dug into his past, uncovering old incidents that had been buried under his father's influence. Bar fights, drunken mishaps, nightclub brawls, all the things Ethan had once swept under the rug. These forgotten transgressions were now resurrected, paraded for the world to see. And suddenly, Ethan was no longer the golden child of the Walker dynasty. He was a disgrace. As Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, the weight of the situation continued to press down on him. His phone buzzed incessantly, but the notifications weren't the ones he wanted to see. Friends who once basked in his shadow now distanced themselves, posting disclaimers and public statements distancing themselves from him. Invitations to exclusive events were rescinded, and social media accounts that once followed him now blocked him or went private. The isolation he felt was suffocating. His entire life, built on the foundation of his family's power and his ability to escape the consequences of his actions, was collapsing. In the media, the narrative spun out of control. The public, once fascinated by his family's power, now saw him as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the elite. Comments flooded every story, every post, every video. One particularly viral reaction video from a university student, Eliza Chen, garnered millions of views. I watched that video and immediately thought of every entitled rich kid who's gotten away with everything, she posted, her voice dripping with disdain. The comment was liked over 50,000 times, and soon it became a rallying cry for those who had grown tired of seeing the powerful avoid the consequences of their actions. And then the phone call came. Ethan's father's voice, always so authoritative, was now filled with frustration and defeat. "There's been a misunderstanding," Ethan stammered, his voice high and cracking with the panic that had been building inside him. But his father's response was clear. "No, Ethan, you've done this to yourself. No one's coming to rescue you." The days that followed were a blur. Crisis management teams worked around the clock, drafting public apologies, holding emergency meetings with ambassadors, and planning damage control. But nothing could change the fact that Ethan had become a symbol of the very thing the public had grown to despise: entitlement without consequence. His father, once the master of political maneuvering, was now helpless. The Walkers' empire was crumbling, and there was no one left to shield them from the fallout. Ethan's apology came in the form of a scripted speech, read in front of cameras, his voice hollow, his expression forced. As he delivered the lines, he realized that the weight of his actions could never be erased, no matter how many times he said he was sorry. The damage had been done, and the world would never look at him the same way again. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible story. What did you think about Ethan's journey and the consequences of his actions? Do you believe entitlement and privilege can be challenged, or is it a system that's too deeply ingrained? We want to know your perspective on what happened at Buckingham Palace and the international fallout that followed. Do you think the media was too harsh, or did Ethan truly deserve the public backlash? Take a moment to share your own thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's privilege led to a dramatic fall from grace? How do you think people should handle situations when their actions have far-reaching consequences? We love reading your stories and hearing how you relate to the situations we discuss here. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts. Your engagement helps us bring more thought-provoking stories like this to light. And remember, subscribing ensures you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Stay tuned. We've got more exciting content coming your way tomorrow.